This photograph was taken at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970. A young woman is kneeling on the ground, her arms raised in anguish, screaming over the body of a student. His name was Jeffrey Miller. He was 20 years old. He had been shot in the mouth by the Ohio National Guard. He was dead. 13 seconds. That's how long the shooting lasted. 67 rounds fired. 4 students killed. 9 wounded. None of them were armed. They were protesting a war, and the government responded by killing them. This wasn't supposed to happen in America. Not on a college campus. Not to middle-class white kids. But it did. And this single photograph, taken by journalism student John Philo, would become one of the most powerful images in American history, winning the Pulitzer Prize and changing how Americans viewed their government forever. Let's go back to where it started. The war no one wanted by 1970. The Vietnam War had been raging for over a decade. American involvement had escalated dramatically under President Lyndon Johnson. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The war was costing billions of dollars, and young American men were dying by the thousands. The draft was in full effect. If you were male, 18 years old, and your number came up, you went to Vietnam. There were no exceptions for most people. Unless you were rich, unless you had connections, unless you could afford college deferments, or find a doctor to declare you unfit for service, college campuses became centers of anti-war protest. Students didn't want to die in a war they didn't believe in, fighting for a cause they didn't understand, in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. He had campaigned on a promise. He had a secret plan to end the war. Americans were desperate for peace. They believed him. They voted for him. They thought the war would finally end. But Nixon had other ideas. The Cambodia invasion, on April 30th, 1970, President Nixon went on national television. He announced that American and South Vietnamese forces had invaded Cambodia. The war wasn't ending. It was expanding. Cambodia was supposed to be neutral. Nixon claimed that North Vietnamese forces were using Cambodia as a sanctuary, a place to hide and regroup. He said the invasion was necessary to protect American troops, to shorten the war, to bring peace. But to millions of Americans, especially young people, it felt like a betrayal. Nixon had promised to end the war. Instead, he was expanding it into another country. The invasion seemed to prove what protesters had been saying all along. The government couldn't be trusted. The war would never end. College campuses erupted in protest. Students walked out of classes. They organized rallies, marches, sit-ins. At some universities, students went on strike, refusing to attend classes until the invasion ended. Kent State University was a mid-sized public university in northeastern Ohio. It wasn't Berkeley or Columbia or Harvard. It wasn't known for radical politics. It was a typical American college, mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly conservative. But even at Kent State, students were angry. On May 1st, 1970, the day after Nixon's announcement, students at Kent State organized a rally on the Commons, the grassy area at the center of campus. About 500 students gathered. They buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution, symbolizing the death of American democracy. Speeches were made. Tensions were high. That night, Friday night, things got out of hand in downtown Kent. Students poured into the bars on North Water Street. They were drinking, they were angry, they were loud. Someone started a bonfire in the middle of the street. Windows were broken. Police tried to disperse the crowd with tear gas. The mayor of Kent, Leroy Satram, was alarmed. He declared a state of emergency. He called Governor James Rhodes and asked for help. Rhodes sent in the Ohio National Guard. The National Guard arrives. By Saturday morning, May 2nd, National Guard troops had arrived in Kent. They wore helmets and gas masks. They carried M1 Garand rifles, military weapons, loaded with live ammunition. They looked like they were preparing for war. That night, Saturday night, someone set fire to the ROTC building on campus. ROTC, the Reserve Officers Training Corps, was a military program that trained college students to become officers. To anti-war protesters, the ROTC building was a symbol of the military-industrial complex, a symbol of the war machine. The building burned to the ground. Firefighters tried to put out the flames, but protesters cut the fire hoses. The National Guard formed a line, trying to keep the crowd back. Students threw rocks and bottles. Guardsmen responded with tear gas. On Sunday, May 3rd, Governor Rhodes arrived in Kent. He held a press conference. He was furious. He called the protesters the worst type of people that we harbor in America. He said they were worse than the brown shirts in the communist element. He said he would use every force possible to remove them from campus. Rhodes was up for re-election. He was trailing in the Republican primary. He needed to look tough on law and order. So he talked tough. He made threats. He vowed to eradicate the protesters. But he never declared martial law. He never gave the National Guard clear rules of engagement. He never told them when they could or couldn't use their weapons. And that vagueness would prove deadly. That Sunday night, students gathered on the Commons again. They wanted to protest the presence of the National Guard on campus. The Guard ordered them to disperse. The students refused. Tear gas was fired. Students scattered. Some students sat down in the street in front of the Guard. They linked arms. They sang protest songs. The Guard moved in with bayonets, literally jabbing at students to make them move. One student was bayoneted in the stomach. The tension was unbearable. Students were angry. Guardsmen were exhausted. Many had been on duty for days with little sleep. They were young themselves, some barely older than the students. Many were weekend warriors, part-time soldiers with little training in crowd control. And they were scared. Monday, May 4th, 1970. Monday morning was warm and sunny. Students went to classes as usual. At noon, a rally was scheduled on the Commons to protest the invasion of Cambodia and the presence of the National Guard on campus. University officials tried to ban the rally. They said all gatherings were prohibited under the state of emergency. But students ignored the order. By noon, between 2,000 and 3,000 people had gathered on the Commons. Some were there to protest. Others were just curious. Some were simply walking between classes. It was a beautiful spring day. The Commons was a normal place to hang out. General Robert Canterbury, the National Guard commander, ordered the students to disperse. His voice crackled over a bullhorn, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Students shouted back, "Pigs off campus! Pigs off campus!" At 12:24 p.m., Canterbury ordered his troops to load and lock their weapons. 77 guardsmen, wearing gas masks and carrying loaded rifles, formed a skirmish line. They marched toward the crowd, firing tear gas. Students scattered, some running away, others retreating to higher ground. The wind was blowing. The tear gas drifted harmlessly away. Students picked up the tear gas canisters and threw them back at the guardsmen. Others threw rocks, sticks, whatever they could find. The Guard marched across the Commons, past the burned-out ROTC building, and onto the football practice field. They were now about 100 yards away from most of the protesters. The crowd jeered at them, taunted them, but kept their distance. The guardsmen seemed trapped on the practice field, surrounded by fences. They had marched themselves into a corner. After a few minutes, they began to retreat, marching back up Blanket Hill toward the Commons. At 12:24 p.m., as the guardsmen reached the top of the hill near Taylor Hall, they turned around, and they opened fire. 13 seconds. That's how long the shooting lasted. 67 rounds were fired from M1 Garand rifles and .45 caliber pistols. The sound echoed across campus. Sharp cracks that didn't sound real, that sounded like firecrackers. Students thought it was a joke at first. They thought the Guard was firing blanks, but then they saw people falling. They saw blood. They heard screaming. Jeffrey Glenn Miller was standing in the parking lot, about 265 feet away from them. Guardsmen. He was watching the protest. He may have thrown a tear gas canister back at the Guard earlier. He was wearing a brown shirt and jeans. A bullet entered his mouth and exited through the back of his neck, severing his spinal cord. He fell face first onto the pavement. Blood poured from his mouth. He died instantly. Allison Krause was standing near the parking lot with her boyfriend, Barry Levine. She was 19 years old, a freshman honor student. She had been placing flowers in the barrels of National Guard rifles earlier, trying to de-escalate the tension. She believed in peace, in dialogue, in nonviolence. A bullet struck her in the left side of her body, tearing through her arm and into her chest. She fell into Barry's arms. He held her as she died. Her last words were, "I'm hit." William Knox Schroeder was an ROTC cadet. He was 19 years old, a sophomore. He wasn't even protesting. He was walking to class. He was 390 feet away from the guardsman when a bullet struck him in the back, piercing his left lung and aorta. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Sandra Scheuer was also just walking to class. She was a 20-year-old junior, majoring in speech therapy. She was over 390 feet away, standing near a parked car. A bullet struck her in the neck, severing her jugular vein. She bled to death within minutes. 9 others were wounded. Joseph Lewis Jr. shot in the right abdomen and left lower leg. He was 71 feet away. John Cleary shot in the upper left chest. He was 110 feet away. Thomas Grace shot in the left ankle. He was 225 feet away. Alan Canfora shot in the right wrist. He was 225 feet away. He had been waving a black flag at the guardsman. Dean Kaler shot in the back, permanently paralyzed from the waist down. He was 300 feet away. Douglas Rentmore shot in the right knee. He was 329 feet away. James Russell shot in the right thigh and right forehead. He was 375 feet away. Robert Stamps shot in the right buttock. He was 495 feet away. Donald Mackenzie shot in the neck. He was 750 feet away, the farthest victim. The closest person shot was 71 feet away. The farthest was 750 feet, nearly the length of 2.5 football fields. None of them were armed. None of them posed a direct threat to the guardsmen. And then, silence. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Students stood frozen in shock. Someone screamed, "They're killing us!" People ran in every direction, some seeking cover, others running toward the wounded. John Philo, a photojournalism student, had been documenting the protest. When the shooting started, he dove behind a car. When it stopped, he stood up and saw Jeffrey Miller's body lying on the pavement, blood pooling around his head. A young woman ran up to Miller's body. Her name was Mary Ann Vecchio. She was 14 years old, a runaway from Florida who had been hanging around the Kent State campus. She dropped to her knees beside Miller's body, raised her arms, and screamed. Philo raised his camera and took the photograph. It would become the defining image of the Kent State shootings, one of the most iconic photographs of the Vietnam War era. A young woman, her face twisted in anguish, kneeling over a dead student on an American college campus. The photograph proved what students had been saying all along. The government would kill its own citizens to silence dissent. The illusion of peace, of safety, of American exceptionalism was shattered. The aftermath. Within minutes, ambulances arrived. The wounded were rushed to Robinson Memorial Hospital. The dead were covered with sheets. Faculty members tried to prevent further violence. Glenn Frank, a geology professor, stood between the students and the National Guard. He was crying. He begged the students to leave, to go home, to avoid another confrontation. "I don't care whether you've never listened to anyone before in your lives," he said. "I am begging you right now. If you don't disperse right now, they're going to move in, and it can only be a slaughter." Students slowly dispersed. The campus was evacuated. Classes were canceled for the rest of the semester. Students were given 30 minutes to pack their belongings and leave. Within hours, Kent State was a ghost town. News of the shootings spread rapidly. Walter Cronkite announced it on the CBS Evening News. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories. The photograph of Mary Ann Vecchio, kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body, appeared everywhere. The nation was divided in its reaction. Many Americans supported the National Guard. A Newsweek poll found that 58% of Americans blamed the students for the deaths. Letters poured into Kent State and the governor's office. Some expressed sympathy for the victims, but many were vicious, blaming the students, saying they deserved to die. One parent of a wounded student received a letter that said, "Is your daughter a whore? Because anyone who appeared on the Commons was a communist and a whore." Jeffrey Miller's mother received hate mail saying her son got what he deserved. The generation gap had never been wider. Older Americans who had lived through World War II and Korea couldn't understand why young people didn't support their country, their government, their military. They saw the protesters as spoiled, ungrateful, treasonous. But young people saw it differently. They saw a government that lied to them, that sent them to die in an unjust war, and that would kill them on their own college campuses if they dared to speak out. College campuses across America erupted in protest. Over 4 million students participated in strikes at more than 450 universities. It was the first and only nationwide student strike in American history. Hundreds of colleges and universities shut down completely. At Jackson State College in Mississippi, a historically black university, police opened fire on a dormitory, killing 2 students and wounding 12. It happened just 11 days after Kent State, but it received far less media attention. The victims were black. America barely noticed. President Nixon's response to Kent State was callous. He called the protesters bums. His staff tried to blame the victims, suggesting the students had provoked the guard. Vice President Spiro Agnew said the deaths were predictable when students challenged authority. But privately, Nixon was worried. He couldn't sleep. He wandered the White House at night, calling aides at odd hours. At 4:30 a.m. on May 9th, 5 days after the shootings, Nixon suddenly decided to visit the Lincoln Memorial, where students were camping out in protest. He spoke with a group of students, rambling about football, surfing, travel. He seemed disconnected, unable to grasp their concerns. One student said afterward, he wasn't really concerned with why we were here. The investigations. Multiple investigations were launched into the Kent State shootings. The FBI conducted an investigation. They interviewed over 1,000 witnesses. They examined the physical evidence. Their conclusion: the guardsmen were not in danger when they fired. The shootings were not justified. An FBI informant had infiltrated the protest movement at Kent State. His name was Terry Norman. He was armed with a pistol that day. For years, some believed he had fired the first shot, provoking the guard to shoot. But ballistics evidence disproved this theory. The President's Commission on Campus Unrest, known as the Scranton Commission, also investigated. Their report, issued in September 1970, was damning. The indiscriminate firing of rifles into a crowd of students and the deaths that followed were unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. But no one was punished. A state grand jury was convened in Ohio. Instead of indicting any guardsmen, the grand jury indicted 25 students and faculty members for causing the riot. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message was clear. The students were to blame. In 1974, a federal grand jury indicted 8 guardsmen for violating the civil rights of the students. The case went to trial in 1975. The judge directed a verdict of acquittal, ruling that the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The families of the victims filed a civil lawsuit against the state of Ohio and the National Guard. The case dragged on for years. In 1979, the state agreed to pay $675,000 to the victims and their families, an average of about $46,000 each. The settlement also included a statement of regret. In retrospect, the tragedy of May 4, 1970 should not have occurred. The students may have believed that they were right in continuing their mass protest in response to the Cambodian invasion, even though this protest followed the posting and reading by the university of an order to ban rallies and an order to disperse. These orders have since been determined by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals to have been lawful. Some of the guardsmen on Blanket Hill, fearful and anxious from prior events, may have believed in their own minds that their lives were in danger. Hindsight suggests that another method would have resolved the confrontation. Better ways must be found to deal with such confrontations. We devoutly wish that a means had been found to avoid the May 4th events, culminating in the guard shootings and the irreversible deaths and injuries. We deeply regret those events and are profoundly saddened by the deaths of 4 students and the wounding of 9 others which resulted. We hope that the agreement to end the litigation will help to assuage the tragic memories regarding that sad day. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. But it was as close as the victims' families would ever get to justice. The legacy. Mary Ann Vecchio, the 14-year-old girl in the photograph, had her life turned upside down. She was recognized immediately. Her parents were contacted. She was labeled a runaway, a troublemaker. She received death threats. People called her a communist. Her family faced harassment for years. For decades, she struggled with what happened that day. She suffered from PTSD, from guilt that she had lived while Jeffrey Miller died. In interviews years later, she said, "I didn't want to be famous for that." John Philo, the photographer, won the Pulitzer Prize for his photograph. But he too was haunted by what he had witnessed. The image made his career, but it also defined his life in ways he never intended. Alan Canfora, shot in the wrist, became a lifelong activist. He spent decades demanding justice for the Kent State victims, collecting evidence, fighting for truth. He carried a bullet fragment in his body for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of May 4th. He died in 2020, 50 years after the shootings, without ever seeing anyone held accountable. Dean Kaler, paralyzed from the waist down, also became an activist. He taught school from a wheelchair, speaking out against war and violence. He said, "I lost the use of my legs, but I found my voice." The parents of the dead students never recovered. Elaine Holstein, Allison Krause's mother, said, "You don't get over it. You just go on." She kept Allison's room exactly as it was the day she left for college. For years, she couldn't bring herself to change anything. Arthur Krause, Allison's father, spent the rest of his life fighting for justice. He said, "She was my daughter. She was everything to me." And they killed her for exercising her constitutional right to protest. Today, there is a memorial at Kent State University. It took decades to build. The university resisted for years, fearful of controversy, fearful of taking sides. But in 1990, 20 years after the shootings, a memorial was finally erected. It's a simple, understated design, a plaza with 4 granite markers, one for each student killed. The markers are placed in the exact spots where Allison Krause, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder fell. In 2010, 40 years after the shootings, the parking lot where Jeffrey Miller died was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The university had wanted to build a gym there. Students and faculty fought to preserve the site. They won. Every May 4th, people gather at Kent State to remember. Survivors speak. Families lay flowers. Students who weren't even born in 1970 come to learn what happened, to understand why it matters. Because Kent State matters. It matters because it shattered the illusion that America was immune to the kind of government violence seen in other countries. It matters because it proved that young people, even white middle-class college students, could be killed by their own government for speaking out. It matters because it was a turning point in the Vietnam War. After Kent State, public opinion turned decisively against the war. Congress began to restrict Nixon's ability to wage war. The anti-war movement grew stronger, more determined. And it matters because the questions it raised are still relevant today. When is protest acceptable? When can the government use force against its own citizens? How do we balance order with freedom, security with liberty? The broader context. Kent State didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a broader pattern of government violence against dissenters in the 1960s and early 1970s. In 1968, police attacked anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, in what was later called a police riot. In 1969, police killed Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in a pre-dawn raid in Chicago. Hampton was shot in his bed while he slept. In 1970, just 11 days after Kent State, police killed 2 students at Jackson State College in Mississippi. Because they were black, their deaths received far less attention. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, a secret campaign to surveil, infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt domestic political organizations, was in full swing. The government viewed anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, and student protesters as threats to national security. Kent State was the moment when this violence became undeniable, when it could no longer be ignored or explained away. The photograph of Mary Ann Vecchio screaming over Jeffrey Miller's body made it real. It made it personal. It made it impossible to look away. What we've learned, or haven't. More than 50 years have passed since the Kent State shootings. In that time, much has changed. The Vietnam War ended. The draft ended. The generation that protested in the 1960s grew up, had children, became the establishment they once rebelled against. But some things haven't changed. Young people still protest against wars they believe are unjust. Police and military forces still confront protesters. Tear gas is still used. Rubber bullets, pepper spray, flash grenades. In 2002, during protests following the murder of George Floyd, federal agents and National Guard troops were deployed to American cities. Protesters were tear-gassed so the president could hold a photo op in front of a church. Journalists were shot with rubber bullets. The echoes of Kent State were unmistakable. We still struggle with the same questions. How should the government respond to civil disobedience? When is force justified? How do we protect both public order and the right to protest? And we still struggle to hold authorities accountable when they use excessive force. Just as no one was ever convicted for the Kent State shootings, police officers who kill unarmed civilians are rarely convicted. The lesson of Kent State, if we've learned it at all, is that government power unchecked is dangerous, that young people have the right to question authority, to demand change, to protest injustice, and that when the government responds to dissent with violence, it loses its moral authority. Conclusion. When you look at that photograph, Mary Ann Vecchio kneeling on the pavement, her arms raised, her mouth open in a scream that seems to echo across the decades, remember what it represents. It represents the death of innocence, the shattering of trust between a generation and its government. It represents 4 students who went to class on a beautiful spring day and never came home. Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krause, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder. It represents 9 students who were wounded, some permanently disabled, all permanently scarred. It represents a nation divided, a war that should never have been fought, and a government willing to kill its own citizens to silence them. But it also represents resistance. It represents the courage to speak out, even when it's dangerous, even when it's unpopular, even when the government tells you to be quiet and obey. The students at Kent State didn't start the Vietnam War. They didn't invade Cambodia. They didn't order the National Guard to open fire. But they refused to stay silent. They refused to accept injustice. And for that, some of them paid with their lives. 13 seconds. 67 rounds. 4 dead, 9 wounded, and 1 photograph that would change America forever. I am a man, the Memphis sanitation workers declared in 1968, demanding dignity and respect. At Kent State in 1970, students demanded the same thing: the right to be heard, the right to dissent, the right to question their government without being killed for it. Both movements remind us that democracy isn't given. It's fought for. It's won through sacrifice, through persistence, through the willingness to stand up and say, "This is wrong. This must change." The photograph taken by John Philo on May 4, 1970, is more than just an image. It's a warning. It's a reminder. It's a testament to what happens when power goes unchecked and when citizens stop questioning their government. Mary Ann Vecchio's scream echoes still. And if we listen closely, we can hear what it's saying. Never forget. Never again. Never stop fighting for justice. The Kent State shootings ended America's illusion of peace. They proved that the violence America exported to Vietnam could come home, that the government could turn its weapons on its own children. But they also proved that even in the darkest moments, even when the cost is high, people will continue to resist. They will continue to demand change. They will continue to believe that a better world is possible. And that, perhaps, is the real legacy of Kent State. Not the violence, not the death, but the enduring power of people who refuse to be silent, who refuse to accept injustice, who refuse to give up on the promise of democracy, even when democracy fails them. 4 students died on May 4th, 1970, but their message lives on. In every protest, in every raised voice, in every person who looks at power and says, "You will not silence us. You will not stop us. We will not be quiet." That is the photograph's true meaning. That is Kent State's real legacy. And that is why, More than 50 years later, we still remember, we still mourn, and we still fight.